The argument, if you're a theist, and I'm going to go with monotheism throughout this, but the argument is if you can be judged, so we'll obviously take a Christian framework on this, that if you can be judged and should be judged, that means you are not entirely subject to natural impulse. Because if you are just subject to natural impulse, you are the creation of God, unable to act in disaccord to the will of God. And the argument from Christianity is you can be at disaccord with the will of God. You can act outside of your intended purpose. So we have to first articulate the concept of there being free will. A true secular materialist will say that all we do is act on biological impulse, and there is no free will. That is a construct. It's a pretty lame argument, but because we can all see every day continually that we're doing things that don't seem to be, that biological impulse seems to be limited in its explanation for behavior, but perhaps we just lack some of the details behind the behavior, or I don't know. Perhaps there's ways we can explain like our desire to do certain actions, and we just haven't kind of put forth a framework to relate action to biological impulse, like a chart to look on. However, there is one thing that I would put on the table and debate any secular materialist on for the evidence of free will, and that is fasting. Fasting upends just that alone upends secular materialism entirely. Because if secular materialism is true, then when me as a material organism enters into caloric deprivation, where now the body is going to have to turn on itself for energy, we enter into, even before that, but obviously if you're fasting, you have entered into that state. But even before that, you enter into the biochemical composition of hunger, because you are if secular materialism is the totality of our worldview, there is no realm outside the natural, then all I am is the physical state of hunger, which is the biochemical composition of the physical state that I am at the time, which is the hormones released that encourage the psyche of the organism, the central nervous system, to how would you say, essentially go procure calories for energy. All I am is the biochemical composition of what I am. So if secular materialism is true, when I enter into caloric deprivation, all I am is the biochemical composition of the state we call hunger, which is the hormones released to encourage the organism psychologically to go procure substance. The fact that in caloric deprivation, we can tell ourselves no, upends secular materialism, because what you are is the physical state of hunger. What you are the chemicals that were released to go get calories. The idea that you can tell that state of being, which is supposed to be all that you are in that moment, no, that is free will determined. That is, for the Christian, as we see it, that is the subjugation of the carnal man to live by the spiritual man. Or even if you don't have a strong argument for a specific theist practice, the idea that is still connection to something beyond the natural, something outside the natural physical realm, because in the physical realm, all you are is the chemicals that your body has released to produce the psychological state to go procure calories to sustain the organism. Fasting, I'll come back to this several times throughout the podcast on these side quests as I get more, as I think about it more and more, and hopefully sharpen the sword of this argument. But I really think there is something there, and I encourage other people to sit and ponder this as well, because there is something there with fasting. It seems to be the single argument that upends secular materialism in its totality, and articulate free will like nothing else. I do not think that once these videos start to gain traction and have an audience and the comments show up, that someone will have a credible argument against this, especially as I learn to articulate this better than I do right now in the initial onset. Maybe we'll conclude it there. I will have to come back with some writing to articulate my thoughts better on this, but I think I got at least kind of the basics out there. This idea that if the claim of secular materialism is true, then the physical organism is only the physical, the chemical composition. The physical organism's psychological state is the physical composition of the chemicals released to encourage the central nervous system of that organism to go procure calories. When the physical, whatever it is, physical structure of the organism detects that it needs to go procure energy to exist in a physical world where we are moving on physical energy. And the fact that the human can override that means we have free will independent of just natural causation. We are like Elohim in a way. We have this, and because we have become in deception like Elohim, knowing good and bad, being able to judge action, we are now accountable to our judgment we are now accountable to the judgments we make on our action. We are not just a robotic animal moving on pure natural impulse. We have corrupted that. We have the capacity to disobey Elohim, Marya, God. And because of that, we have stepped into the position of being worth judgment. We can be judged for what we have done throughout our existence, because we exist as judges of action, independent of just moving on natural cause and impulse. If we were just moving on natural cause and impulse, you could make the argument that God should not judge the living and the dead. But because we can, and because we do, it is just and right that Marya judge the living and the dead. For the dead have acted in their own accord, as acted autonomous, rather than as like totally conformed to the monotheist. We act in autonomy, as Hasatan, the adversary, is that initial concept of being in like a disunion from the singularity, which is Marya, the monotheist God. And humans have followed him. And so now we are in this mass disaccord throughout the earth. And yeah, I guess I'll just conclude this first one there. I hope you continue and follow me through this. I'm going to translate the Peshitta off the Eastern text and go word by word, verse by verse. I'm not sure what books I'm going to begin with. I have the first chapter of Matthew translated, the genealogy. I decided I want to restore Aramaic names, regions, certain terms that I believe have lost some level of context in a Western language. And I'm going to do a Greek study as well on some of these books. Obviously, the writings of Shaul Paul were written originally in Greek, and other than maybe Hebrews, it looks as though I haven't studied too far into it myself, but it seems to be a wide consensus that he wrote the book of Hebrews. And in that, I would assume that Hebrews was probably written in a Near Eastern language originally. And as we get to reading it both off a Greek base and a Near Eastern base, I think whether you lose symbolism or sustain, like if we read in an Eastern text and then the Western text loses certain symbolism, then I would start to lean towards it was originally written in the East text, and the East speaks forth what his original intention were over the Western text. But we'll get there when we get there. So yeah, I guess just follow me along this. This is the first video, and we're going to get into social concepts, arguments such as this one in this episode, and breaking down the text word by word to explain spiritual realities. And that's that.